Surrounded on a beach near Kobe, his army crushed between an enemy fleet and tens of thousands of soldiers. One general refused to flee. He had warned his emperor this battle was unwinnable, so why did he fight? And the answer begins years early.
He led an army of 700 against 300,000. He knew he would lose, and he marched anyway. What made a samurai choose certain death over disobedience? In 1331, Japan's Emperor Go-Daigo made a desperate decision. For over a century, real power had belonged not to the throne, but to the Kamakura shogunate's military regents. Determined to reclaim it, Go-Daigo called for loyal warriors to rise against the shogunate's army, one of the largest military forces in Japanese history. Almost no one answered. But in the hills of Kawachi province, a minor local lord named Kusunoki Masashige did. He commanded perhaps a few hundred men. The shogunate would send tens of thousands to crush him. He had no army to match them, only his mind. At Akasaka, a hastily built wooden fort, Masashige faced a Kamakura army many times his size. He had no hope of winning a straight fight, so he refused to fight one. His men dropped boiling water and rocks on climbing soldiers, swung logs to crush ladders, and lit the fortress on fire themselves before slipping away into the night, leaving the enemy to celebrate a victory over empty ruins. It was a defeat on paper. In practice, Masashige had vanished with his army intact and proven that a small force could humiliate the mightiest army in Japan. Months later, Masashige made his stand at Chihaya, a fortress perched on a steep mountainside with only one narrow approach. The shogunate sent an army said to number over 100,000 men to take it. Masashige's garrison numbered in the hundreds. Yet for months, his men hurled boulders down the cliffsides, used straw dummies to lure attackers into ambushes, and poured scalding liquid onto soldiers trapped on narrow paths. Chihaya never fell. And while the shogunate's massive army sat pinned down at one mountain fortress, rebellions against it spread like wildfire across the rest of Japan. The siege of Chihaya became the spark. Inspired by Masashige's defiance, more lords abandoned the shogunate and joined the emperor's cause. Among them was a powerful general named Ashikaga Takauji, originally sent to crush the rebellion, who switched sides instead. Within weeks, the Kamakura shogunate, which had ruled Japan for nearly 150 years, collapsed entirely. Emperor Go-Daigo returned to power in what became known as the Kenmu Restoration. Masashige, the obscure local lord who refused to lose, was now one of the most celebrated warriors in the empire, and one of the emperor's most trusted men. But the new government quickly ran into trouble. Go-Daigo wanted to restore an idealized imperial past with power centered on the court rather than the warrior class that had just won his war for him. Land and titles meant to reward fighting men instead went disproportionately to court nobles who had risked nothing. Samurai who had bled for the restoration watched aristocrats receive the spoils. Resentment spread quickly through the warrior class, including among the very generals who had made Go-Daigo's victory possible. It would not take long for that resentment to find a leader. That leader was Ashikaga Takauji. In 1335, frustrated by the court's treatment of the warrior class and his own ambitions, Takauji rose in open revolt against Go-Daigo. He marched on Kyoto with a powerful army. Imperial forces, including Masashige and the general Nita Yoshisada, fought back fiercely and drove Takauji's army out of the capital, pushing him all the way to the western coast. For a moment, it looked as though the rebellion had been crushed. But Takauji did not surrender. He fled to the island of Kyushu and began rebuilding his army for a far larger invasion. Within months, Takauji had transformed his shattered army into something far more dangerous. He gathered the support of powerful clans across western Japan, assembling a combined land and naval force said to number in the tens of thousands, vastly larger than anything the imperial court could field. In the early summer of 1336, this army began moving east toward Kyoto by both sea and land, converging from two directions at once. Word of the approaching force reached the capital. The court that had so recently celebrated victory now faced an enemy stronger than the one it had just defeated. Masashige proposed a plan. Abandon Kyoto temporarily, draw Takauji's forces deep into the city, then crush them in a pincer attack once they were overextended. It was the kind of unconventional strategy that had won at Akasaka and Chihaya. But the court's leading advisor, Bomon Kiyotada, refused. Retreating from the capital again would humiliate the emperor. Masashige was ordered to march out and meet Takauji's army head-on near Minatogawa, a battle he believed could not be won. On his way, he stopped at Sakurai and said goodbye to his 11-year-old son, Masatsura, sending him home and giving him final instructions. At Minatogawa, near present-day Kobe, Masashige's force of roughly 700 men took up position alongside Nita Yoshisada's army. Ahead of them, Takauji's land forces advanced in overwhelming numbers. Behind them, his fleet landed troops directly onto the beach, cutting off any retreat. Within hours, Nita's forces were pushed back, leaving Masashige's small contingent isolated and surrounded on nearly every side. Outnumbered by more than 100 to 1, with no reinforcements coming and no path home, Masashige's men fought anyway, charging again and again into a battle that everyone on that beach already knew was lost. For nearly 6 hours, Masashige's men fought wave after wave of attackers, charging the enemy line more than a dozen times. One by one, his soldiers fell. By the time the fighting slowed, only around 70 of his original 700 men remained standing. Wounded and exhausted, Masashige and his surviving troops withdrew to a small farmhouse near the battlefield, not to escape, but because there was nowhere left to retreat to. Outside, Takauji's forces continued to close in. Inside, Masashige gathered his remaining men, including his younger brother, Masatsura, for what everyone understood would be their final moments. According to the chronicle Taiheki, Masashige turned to his brother and asked what he wished for in his next life. Masatsura reportedly answered that he wished to be reborn 7 times to destroy the enemies of the emperor, a phrase that became known as Shichisei Hokoku. Masashige is said to have agreed. Then, together with his brother and the remaining loyal retainers, he took his own life inside the farmhouse rather than be captured. He was around 42 years old. The Battle of Minatogawa was over. So, for the moment, was the cause he had given his life for. Within days, Takauji's forces entered Kyoto. Emperor Go-Daigo fled south to the mountains of Yoshino, where he established a rival court, beginning more than 50 years of civil war between 2 competing imperial lines, a period historians call the Nanboku-cho era. Takauji installed a new emperor in Kyoto and founded the Ashikaga shogunate, which would rule Japan for over 2 centuries. Masashige's death had not saved Go-Daigo's restoration. In purely military terms, his final stand had changed nothing. And yet, in the centuries that followed, his name would only grow more powerful, not for what he won, but for why he fought. Masashige's son, Masatsura, grew up hearing the story of his father's final stand. 12 years later, as a young commander himself, he led loyalist forces against the Ashikaga shogunate at the Battle of Shijonawate in 1348, and, like his father, fought a battle he likely could not win. He died there at around 22 years old. Father and son had both chosen the same path, loyalty to a losing cause, carried to its absolute end. To later generations, the Kusunoki family became less a story about military success and more a story about what loyalty was supposed to look like. For centuries afterward, Masashige's story was retold as the ultimate model of loyalty in Japanese culture. The medieval epic, Taiheki, turned his life into legend, emphasizing his brilliance, his humility, and above all, his willingness to die for a cause he knew was doomed. He became known by the honorific title Nanko, Lord Kusunoki of the South, and was held up in art, in storytelling, and in education as the standard against which loyal service should be measured. In a society built around hierarchical loyalty, Masashige offered the cleanest possible example: total devotion, with no expectation of victory or reward. That image became especially powerful in the 19th century. After the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japan's new imperial government searched history for symbols of unconditional loyalty to the emperor, and found one ready-made in Kusunoki Masashige. A bronze statue of him on horseback was erected outside the imperial palace in Tokyo, where it still stands today. His story was taught in schools as a model of self-sacrifice, and during the militarist era of the 1930s and 40s, his willingness to die for the emperor was invoked to justify demands for similar sacrifice from an entire generation of soldiers. How much of this story is verified history and how much is legend is genuinely difficult to untangle. Much of what we know about Masashige comes from the Taiheki, a work written decades after his death, and clearly designed, in part, to glorify the imperial cause. The broad outline, his guerrilla campaigns, his death at Minatogawa, his loyalty to Go-Daigo, is generally accepted by historians. But many specific details, including his most famous quotes, may have been shaped, embellished, or invented entirely by storytellers working for a political agenda centuries after the fact.
Strip away the legend, and what remains is still remarkable. A minor provincial lord who, through sheer tactical creativity, brought down one of history's most entrenched military regimes, and who, faced with an order he believed was a mistake, chose to obey it anyway, rather than abandon the emperor he had sworn to serve. Whether that choice makes him history's greatest example of loyalty, or a cautionary tale about following orders into a battle that cannot be won, is a question Japan has been arguing about for nearly 700 years. Centuries later, on the battlefields of the Sengoku period, a different kind of warrior would inspire fear rather than reverence. Clad entirely in blood-red armor, one samurai's unit became so feared that enemies reportedly fled at the mere sight of them. They were called the Red Devils, and their leader's name was Naomasa. Next time on Samurai Chronicles, we'll uncover how a single color turned one army into Japan's most terrifying fighting force.
Kusunoki Masashige never won the war he fought for, but in choosing loyalty over survival, he became something more lasting than a victorious general, a symbol that outlived every battle, every regime, and every century that followed. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more deep dives into the warriors, schemers, and legends of Japanese history. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.